They say the internet never forgets, but sometimes it remembers things it shouldn't, things that bleed from the digital shadows into the edges of our reality. This started with a glitch. A fleeting anomaly in a corner of the web most people never see. A forum dedicated to the truly strange, the unexplainable. I've always been drawn to the unsettling corners of the digital world, the places where logic frays and the impossible seems just a click away. This forum, Nocturne Nexus, was one such place, a digital sanctuary for those who'd glimpsed the void and lived to tell the tale, or at least type about it in hushed digital tones. Most of the threads were easily dismissed, elaborate hoaxes, misinterpretations of mundane events, or the overactive imaginations of late-night scrollers. But every now and then, something would surface that sent a genuine shiver down your spine, a narrative so consistent, so disturbingly detailed, that it burrowed its way into your subconscious. It was a thread, like so many others, people sharing their brushes with the bizarre. But this one, it felt different, a slow burn of unease that spread through the digital ether. It centered around a place, a church, unmarked on any map, unmentioned in any local history, a phantom in the rural landscape. The initial posts were vague, almost hesitant. Users spoke of fleeting glimpses from desolate highways, a Gothic steeple rising against a bruised twilight sky, only to vanish moments later as if it were a mirage. There were no photographs, no concrete evidence, just these ephemeral accounts that painted a picture of something ancient and malevolent lurking just beyond the veil of the ordinary. As more accounts trickled in, a pattern began to emerge, a chilling consistency that couldn't be easily dismissed as mass hysteria or coordinated fabrication. The details were fragmented, almost dreamlike. Whispers passed between users like secrets in a darkened room. It only appeared to certain people, they said, people marked in some way, an unusual birthmark, a shape that seemed wrong, a recurring nightmare that clung to them like a second skin, its tendrils reaching into their waking hours. That feeling of being watched in the dead of night, the weight on your chest as you lie paralyzed, convinced of a presence just beyond the edge of your vision. These weren't just random occurrences, they were the criteria, the silent invitation to this spectral sanctuary. And the time always the same, 3:33 a.m., the witching hour amplified. They said the doors would unlock then, not through any physical mechanism, but willingly, for a purpose no one truly understood, except perhaps Saint Never. That name kept appearing, Saint Never, a cryptic presence in the thread, offering fragmented clues, unsettling pronouncements. Their profile was blank, their posting history a series of cryptic warnings and unsettling observations about the church and its unseen congregation. They spoke in riddles and half-truths, their words imbued with a chilling certainty that bordered on the prophetic. Their last message, the one that truly snagged my attention, it was simple, terrifyingly so. It was a direct reply to a user who had scoffed at the entire narrative, calling it an elaborate hoax. Saint Never's response was chillingly concise, mock if you wish, but if you hear the sermon you're already dead. That was it, no explanation, just that chilling warning, hanging in the digital void like a shroud. Like an idiot drawn to a flickering flame, I started digging, cross-referencing the fragmented details, piecing together the whispers. I scoured online archives, local historical societies, anything that might shed light on this phantom church. The silence was deafening, no record, no mention, as if this place had somehow been erased from the annals of history. But the consistency of the online accounts, the shared details that couldn't easily be explained away, it gnawed at me. And then I found it, a set of coordinates, buried deep in a now-deleted 4chan thread, echoing some of the details from the Nocturne Nexus forum. Blackwater, Tennessee, a place that felt forgotten, a blank spot on the map where the veil between worlds might just be thin enough to allow something like this to exist. Against every instinct screaming at me to stay away, I went. The morbid curiosity, the need to see if the darkness online could manifest in the real world, it was a pull I couldn't resist. I told myself it was research, a quest for a good story. But deep down, I knew it was something more primal, a fascination with the forbidden. Hours I drove, into the kind of silence that presses against your eardrums, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something indefinable, but unsettling, a faint metallic tang that prickled at the back of my throat. The further I drove, the more the familiar world seemed to recede, replaced by an oppressive stillness that felt ancient and watchful. I found the place, hidden deep within the woods, exactly where the coordinates led, and there it was, the church, rotting, silent, waiting. It looked exactly as the online descriptions had painted it, a skeletal silhouette against the moonlit sky, its Gothic architecture twisted and decaying, as if time itself had soured within its walls. The red glow from the doorway pulsed faintly, like a malevolent eye in the darkness, beckoning me closer. The air around it felt heavy, charged with an energy that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. The gates, it was chained, padlocked, seemed like a dead end, a tangible barrier against the digital nightmare I had chased into the real world. A wave of relief washed over me, quickly followed by a sharp pang of disappointment. Maybe it was just a story after all, until I checked the time. 3:32 a.m. I told myself I'd wait a minute, just 1 minute. What harm could it do? The silence of the woods seemed to hold its breath, the only sound the frantic thumping of my own heart. And then the lock clicked open, on its own, as if an unseen hand had turned the key, the heavy mechanism sighing as it disengaged. The chain fell slack, swaying gently in the non-existent breeze. A cold dread washed over me, replacing the earlier relief. This wasn't just a story. This was real. I went inside. The air inside was colder, heavier than the night outside. It smelled of dust and decay, and something else. Something ancient and wrong, like the scent of dried blood mixed with incense. The darkness inside was absolute, broken only by the faint red glow emanating from some unseen source deeper within the church. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, revealing rows upon rows of pews, and seated in each pew were figures, lifeless, still, dressed in what appeared to be old funeral clothes, their faces obscured by shadow, their stillness more unnerving than any frantic movement. They were just sitting there, row after row of them, silent, unmoving, like a congregation frozen in a moment of terrible stillness, waiting for a service that would never end. The silence was broken only by the sound of my own breathing and the faint creaking of the ancient wooden floorboards beneath my feet. I told myself they were statues, just decorations, some elaborate, macabre display, but there was something about their posture, the way their heads were tilted at unnatural angles. It felt like they were watching me, their unseen eyes following my every move in the darkness. A prickling sensation ran down my spine, the feeling of being observed by a multitude of unseen eyes. The altar wasn't empty. There was something there, a figure, cloaked in deep shadow, standing at the pulpit. A faint, distorted chanting sound began to emanate from this area, a low, guttural murmur that seemed to vibrate through the very foundations of the church. And as it slowly began to turn. The figure at the altar was tall and gaunt, its form swallowed by the tattered remnants of what might have once been priestly robes. The chanting grew slightly louder, the words indistinguishable, yet carrying a weight of sorrow and malevolence that chilled me to the bone. As it turned slowly, deliberately, the faint red glow from behind it illuminated its features in fleeting glimpses. I saw the pale gleam of skin stretched taut over sharp bone, the hollow sockets where eyes should have been, and a mouth sewn shut with thick, dark thread. A wave of nausea washed over me. This wasn't a statue. This was something else, something ancient and wrong. The air grew colder, and the scent of decay intensified, laced with a metallic tang that made my stomach churn. The chanting intensified, the distorted syllables seeming to claw at my sanity. Then, the figure raised a skeletal hand, its long, bony finger pointing directly at something on the altar. My gaze followed, drawn by an invisible force. On the dusty surface lay an open book. Its pages were brittle and yellowed, the script indecipherable, filled with strange symbols and diagrams that seemed to writhe before my eyes. But the title was chillingly clear, even in the dim light. Psalm 333. As my eyes focused on the title, a sound began to emanate from the seated figures in the pews. It started as a low murmur, a collective sigh that seemed to rise from the very depths of the church. But it quickly escalated, morphing into a chorus of voices, distorted and overlapping, a cacophony of whispers that clawed at my ears. They weren't speaking words I could understand, but the intent was clear, a profound, suffocating sorrow, laced with an undercurrent of something predatory. The figure at the altar, the preacher, if that's what it was, remained silent, its sewn mouth a grotesque mockery of speech. But its presence was a palpable weight, a suffocating blanket of dread. It gestured again towards the hymn book, and as it did, the chanting from the pews intensified, swirling around me like a vortex of despair. Suddenly, a faint flickering light appeared at the back of the church. It was a projector, old and dusty, its beam cutting through the gloom, illuminating a section of the far wall. Images began to flicker across the wall, grainy and distorted. At first they were abstract shapes, swirling patterns of darkness and light. But then they began to coalesce, forming recognizable images. My breath hitched in my throat. The images were of a house, my childhood home. Scenes flickered across the wall. The front porch bathed in the golden light of a summer evening, the living room decorated for Christmas, my bedroom window illuminated by the soft glow of a nightlight. These were memories, intimate and personal, moments from my life that no stranger could possibly know. The chanting from the pews intensified, the distorted voices now seeming to whisper fragments of words, half-formed sentences that echoed snippets of conversations I had long forgotten. The projector continued its macabre slideshow, each image a deeper cut into my sense of reality. Then the images shifted. They became darker, more disturbing, fleeting glimpses of me sleeping in my bed, unaware of the unseen presence that seemed to loom over me in the darkness. Moments of sleep paralysis, my eyes wide with terror as I struggled to move, the shadowy figures in the periphery of my vision now captured on the grainy film. The preacher at the altar remained motionless, its hollow gaze fixed on me. Then slowly, deliberately, it raised its hand and reached up to its face. My blood ran cold as I watched its skeletal fingers grasp the edge of its pale, stretched skin. With a sickening tearing sound, it began to peel its face away. What lay beneath was not flesh and bone, but a hollow void, a gaping maw of absolute darkness. A visual glitch seemed to ripple through the air around it, distorting the light and the very fabric of the church. The chanting reached a fever pitch, the voices a chorus of tormented souls. That's when the realization hit me, a cold, sickening wave that washed over me and threatened to drown my sanity. The camera in my hand, I hadn't pressed record. I hadn't been documenting this from a safe distance. I was here, I was living it. This wasn't a video I was making. This was happening to me. The projector flickered again, the images on the wall now showing me, standing in that very church, my face contorted in terror. But these weren't past memories, these were present. And then the final image flashed across the wall, me, lying still and pale on the altar, the preacher standing over me, its hollow face a silent scream. The chanting stopped abruptly. The church fell silent, the only sound my own ragged breathing. The preacher extended a long, bony finger towards a chalice that had appeared on the altar. It was filled with a viscous, dark liquid that seemed to absorb all light. A reflection shimmered in the dark liquid. It wasn't my face that I saw, it was me, but different. My eyes were hollow, my skin pale and stretched, my mouth sewn shut with thick, dark thread, and in my hand I saw a glint of silver, a knife, pointed at my own throat. Panic seized me, a primal urge to escape this waking nightmare. I stumbled backward, knocking over a pew, the sound echoing loudly in the oppressive silence. The figures in the pews remained motionless, their unseen eyes still fixed on me. I turned and ran, scrambling back down the aisle, my heart pounding in my chest like a trapped bird. I reached the heavy wooden doors, my hands fumbling with the latch. I threw them open and burst out into the night air, gasping for breath. But the outside world wasn't the sanctuary I had hoped for. The church grounds were gone, replaced by a twisted, mirrored version of the interior. The same pews, the same silent figures, the same oppressive darkness. Except now their heads were all turned towards me, their unseen eyes filled with a chilling awareness. Their whispers began again, soft at first, but growing in volume, overlapping and intertwining, forming a single unified message that echoed in my mind. You're part of the flock now. You can never leave. The sermon has begun. Despair washed over me, the crushing weight of inevitability. I was trapped. This wasn't a place you could simply walk away from. Then everything went black. I gasped, my eyes snapping open. I was lying in my bed, the familiar surroundings of my bedroom, a stark contrast to the nightmarish reality I had just experienced. The digital clock on my nightstand read 3:47 a.m. Relief flooded through me, so potent it almost brought me to tears. It had been a dream, a terrible, vivid dream, fueled by the unsettling stories I had read online. I reached for my laptop, wanting to ground myself in the familiar glow of the screen. It was open to the video editing software. The footage from the church was there, the thumbnails chillingly familiar. I clicked play, my heart pounding in my chest. The shaky handheld footage began to roll, the events unfolding exactly as I remembered them. The mannequins, the preacher, the psalm, the horrifying reflection. It was all there, but then I noticed the timestamp on the files. They weren't from tonight, they were dated next week. A notification popped up in the corner of the screen. It was from Reddit. Saint Never followed you. The digital notification pulsed on the screen, the stark white text against the dark background, a chillingly clinical confirmation of the impossible. Saint Never had followed me. A phantom from the digital ether had somehow reached into my reality, a digital tendril snaking its way into my waking nightmare. My breath hitched, a cold knot tightening in my chest. This wasn't a dream. The footage on my laptop, dated a week in the future, was irrefutable proof. I had been there, I had experienced it, and somehow a part of me was still trapped within those decaying walls. A frantic energy surged through me. I had to understand. I had to find a way out. I closed the laptop, the sudden darkness of the screen amplifying the oppressive silence of my room. The digital clock still glowed 3:47 a.m. Had no time passed, or was time itself behaving differently now, warped by whatever unholy presence resided in that church? I threw back the covers and stumbled out of bed, my legs shaky and uncertain. The familiar comfort of my room now felt tainted, every shadow seeming to hold a lurking menace. I had to see if it was real. The birthmark on my forearm, the one I had dismissed for so long as a mere imperfection, now felt like a brand, a mark that had somehow drawn me to that forsaken place. I stared at it in the dim light filtering through my window, its ambiguous shape now seeming to twist and writhe in my perception, almost forming the shape of an inverted cross. Driven by a desperate need for answers, I reopened my laptop. The Nocturne Nexus forum was still open on the thread about the Blackwater church. A new post had appeared, time-stamped just minutes ago. It was from Saint Never, a single sentence that sent a fresh wave of icy terror through me. The sermon continues. I scrolled through the rest of the thread, my eyes scanning frantically for any clue, any hint of escape. Other users were posting, their tone a mixture of fear and morbid fascination. Some recounted similar experiences, fleeting glimpses of the church, unsettling dreams, the chilling feeling of being watched. One user, Silent Observer 77, claimed to have seen the church appear briefly in their rearview mirror while driving late at night, only to vanish as quickly as it appeared. Another, Drawn to the Dark, described vivid nightmares of being part of a silent congregation, their mouths sewn shut, forced to listen to an incomprehensible sermon. But there was no mention of escape, no guide for those who had been chosen. It was as if once you were drawn into its orbit, you were forever bound to its silent, terrifying ritual. Days blurred into a nightmarish cycle of fear and obsession. I barely slept, haunted by fragmented images of the decaying church, the silent figures, the hollow-faced preacher. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow in the periphery of my vision sent a jolt of terror through me. I jumped at sudden noises, my senses hyper-alert, constantly scanning my surroundings for any sign that the church or its inhabitants had followed me. I delved deeper into the lore surrounding the number 333, searching for any connection to the unsettling events I had witnessed. I found references to it as an inverted 666, a number associated with the Antichrist and demonic forces. Some interpretations linked it to a state of imbalance, a disruption of spiritual harmony. None of it offered any comfort, only amplifying my growing sense of dread. The footage on my laptop continued to play in my mind. The events of that nightmarish visit seared into my memory. I replayed it over and over, searching for any detail I might have missed, any clue that could explain what had happened and how the footage could exist in the future. The more I watched, the more unsettling it became. Subtle details I hadn't noticed before began to surface: the almost imperceptible twitch of a mannequin's head, the fleeting glimpse of a symbol carved into a pew, a barely audible whisper within the distorted chanting. Driven by a desperate need to understand the nature of the entity I had encountered, I began researching local folklore and legends of Blackwater, Tennessee. I spent hours poring over dusty historical archives, interviewing elderly residents, searching for any mention of a forgotten church, a tragic event, anything that might explain the malevolent presence I had encountered. Most of the locals dismissed my inquiries with wary glances and muttered warnings about the dangers of venturing into the old woods. But one old woman, her eyes clouded with age and a hint of something else, fear, perhaps, recounted a local legend of a zealous preacher who had led his congregation into the woods decades ago, promising them salvation through a ritual performed at the stroke of 3:33 a.m. They had never returned. Her story sent a fresh wave of chills down my spine. Could this be the origin of the silent congregation? Had their ritual gone horribly wrong, trapping them in some unholy purgatory, forever bound to repeat their final, terrifying moments? The days continued to pass, each one an agonizing stretch of fear and uncertainty. The future footage on my laptop remained unchanged, a constant, looming reminder of the horror that awaited me. I tried to rationalize it, to find a logical explanation. A vivid dream that somehow imprinted itself onto my hard drive, a sophisticated hoax, but the visceral terror I had felt in that church, the chillingly personal details, the impossible opening of the lock, it all felt too real to be dismissed so easily. Then another message appeared on the Nocturne Nexus forum from St. Never. This one was different. It wasn't a cryptic warning or a continuation of the sermon. It was a direct message, addressed to me, using my online handle. The marked cannot hide. The choir awaits its final member. My blood ran cold. They knew. It knew. Whatever malevolent entity resided in that church was aware of me, was actively seeking me. The digital barrier had been breached. The hunt had begun. A desperate idea began to form in my mind. If the church existed outside the normal flow of time, if the footage was from the future, perhaps I could change that future. Perhaps I could find a way to sever the connection, to break the cycle before it reached its terrifying conclusion. I decided I had to go back to Blackwater, back to the church. This time not as a curious observer, but as someone fighting for their very soul. I knew it was insane, a descent into the very heart of the nightmare that haunted my waking hours. But staying here, waiting for the future to unfold as the footage foretold, was a slow, agonizing death sentence. I packed a bag with essentials: flashlights, extra batteries, a camera. This time, I would make sure it was recording, and a small, antique silver crucifix that had belonged to my grandmother, a fragile talisman against an unknown evil. As I packed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was preparing for a journey from which I might never return. The drive back to Blackwater felt different this time. The familiar roads seemed darker, the shadows deeper, the silence more oppressive. Every rustle in the trees, every flicker of movement in the periphery of my vision sent a jolt of fear through me. The air crackled with an unseen tension, as if the very landscape was aware of my return. As I neared the coordinates, a thick fog began to roll in, shrouding the woods in an eerie, ethereal mist. The temperature dropped sharply, and a bone-chilling wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it a faint, distorted chanting sound. The church steeple emerged from the fog like a skeletal finger pointing towards the heavens, its decaying form even more menacing in the swirling mist. The red glow from the doorway seemed to pulse with a malevolent intensity, a beacon in the oppressive gloom. This time, the gate stood wide open, as if welcoming me back into its embrace. The heavy chains lay on the ground, cold and inert, a silent invitation. Hesitantly, I stepped onto the overgrown path, the crunch of dead leaves under my boots the only sound in the suffocating silence. The air was thick with the familiar scent of decay, and something else, something ancient and metallic, stronger now, almost overpowering. As I reached the church doors, they creaked open slowly, revealing the familiar darkness within. But this time there was a change. The silent figures in the pews were no longer still. Their heads were slowly turning, their unseen eyes fixed on me, and from the depths of the church, the distorted chanting grew louder, closer. The figure at the altar stood waiting, its hollow gaze unwavering. It raised a skeletal hand, beckoning me forward, and then I saw it. On the altar, next to the open hymn book, lay another chalice. This one was empty, waiting. A voice echoed in my mind, not spoken aloud, but a cold, clear thought that resonated deep within my skull. The final member has arrived. The sermon is about to begin. Terror, raw and primal, threatened to overwhelm me, but beneath the fear, a flicker of defiance ignited. I might not know how to escape this nightmare, but I wouldn't go down without a fight. I clutched the silver crucifix in my hand, its smooth, cool surface a small comfort in the face of unimaginable horror. The preacher began to move, its tattered robes rustling in the oppressive silence. The silent figures in the pews shifted, their unseen eyes never leaving me. The chanting intensified, a chorus of the damned welcoming a new soul into their fold. This was it. The future foretold on the footage was about to become my present. But as the preacher reached out a skeletal hand towards me, I knew one thing for certain. I wouldn't go quietly. The sermon might be about to begin, but my silence was over. The fight for my soul had just begun. The air crackled with anticipation, the red glow from the depths of the church casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe with a life of their own. The distorted chanting reached a crescendo, a deafening symphony of despair that threatened to shatter my sanity. This was the heart of the nightmare, the epicenter of the unholy ritual, and I was standing right in the middle of it. The silent congregation watched, their unseen eyes burning into me. The preacher loomed, its hollow face a mask of eternal hunger. The empty chalice on the altar seemed to pulse with an unseen energy, waiting to receive its offering. My offering, but I wouldn't let that happen. I had come back for answers, but I would leave with my soul intact or die trying. The battle for my future, a future I had glimpsed in chilling detail, had begun. The weight of the unseen eyes, the oppressive silence punctuated by the guttural chanting, the palpable presence of ancient evil, it all converged on this single, terrifying moment. My hand tightened around the crucifix, its cold metal a stark contrast to the burning fear that coursed through my veins. This was the sermon they had been waiting for, but they were about to discover that their final member wasn't ready to join their silent choir. Not without a fight, the air crackled with unseen energy, the very stones of the church seeming to vibrate with anticipation. This was the reckoning. This was the moment where the future I had witnessed would either become my inescapable reality, or the moment I defied the very forces of darkness that held this place in their thrall. The distorted chanting echoed in my ears, a morbid invitation to oblivion, but I would not succumb. I would not become another silent figure in their eternal congregation. The fight for my soul, for my very existence, had reached its terrifying climax. The preacher's skeletal hand reached for me, its touch promising a cold oblivion, an eternity of silent servitude within this decaying sanctuary. But the silver crucifix in my grip felt strangely warm, a small spark of defiance against the encroaching darkness. As the bony fingers brushed against my skin, a jolt, not of pain, but of pure, searing energy coursed through me. The chanting faltered, the distorted voices in the pews momentarily silenced by an unseen force. The preacher recoiled, a hiss escaping its sewn mouth, a sound that scraped against the very edges of reality. The air in the church crackled, the red glow intensifying, casting grotesque, dancing shadows that writhed on the crumbling walls. The silent figures in the pews stirred, their unseen eyes now burning with a palpable hostility. The fragile truce had shattered. The final member had refused to join the choir. This was my chance. I stumbled backward, putting distance between myself and the altar, my eyes darting around the mirrored interior, searching for any sign of escape. But the doors through which I had entered now led only to more pews, more silent figures, an endless labyrinth of despair. The whispers began again, no longer a unified chant, but individual voices, hissing and spitting words I couldn't understand, yet their intent was clear. I was an unwelcome disruption, a stray lamb refusing the slaughter. Panic threatened to overwhelm me, but the image of the future footage flashed in my mind, my lifeless body on the altar, the hollow-faced preacher looming over me. That future wasn't inevitable. I could fight. Clutching the crucifix, I lunged towards the altar, my only thought to disrupt the ritual, to break the connection that bound this unholy place. The preacher moved with surprising speed, its tattered robes swirling around it like a shroud. It intercepted me, its cold, bony hands grasping my arms in a vice-like grip. A wave of icy dread washed over me. Its touch felt like death itself, draining the warmth from my body, replacing it with a creeping numbness. But I held firm, the silver crucifix pressed against its skeletal chest. Another jolt of energy erupted, and the preacher recoiled again, its grip momentarily weakening. Using the opportunity, I twisted free and scrambled onto the altar, knocking over the open hymn book. The brittle pages fluttered to the ground, revealing more of the strange, unsettling script. As the book fell, a gust of unseen wind swept through the church, extinguishing some of the red glow, plunging parts of the interior into deeper shadow. The chanting from the pews became more frantic, a chorus of outrage. My eyes fell upon the empty chalice. An instinct, primal and desperate, surged through me. I grabbed it, its cold, smooth surface strangely grounding in the chaos. What if this was the key, the vessel for their unholy sacrament? Before I could act, the preacher lunged again, its hollow face contorted in a silent scream of fury. It swiped at me with its long, sharp fingers, and I barely managed to dodge the blow, feeling the cold rush of air as its hand passed inches from my face. Adrenaline coursed through me, overriding the terror. I swung the empty chalice, striking the preacher across its hollow face. The sound was sickeningly hollow, like hitting bone against bone. The preacher staggered back, its silent scream intensifying. The figures in the pews began to rise, their movements jerky and unnatural. Their unseen eyes burned with an unholy light, and the whispers intensified, becoming a deafening roar of condemnation. I was surrounded. There was no escape through the doors. The mirrored interior offered no exit. My only option was to confront the source of this evil, to disrupt the ritual at its heart. I turned back to the altar, my eyes fixed on the preacher. It stood swaying, its hollow gaze fixed on me, a silent fury radiating from its very being. It raised its hands again, and the air around it crackled with dark energy. I knew instinctively that it was about to unleash something terrible. My time was running out. With a desperate cry, I hurled the empty chalice at the preacher. It struck true, hitting it squarely in its hollow chest. This time the reaction was different. A high-pitched shriek, a sound that seemed to tear the very fabric of reality, erupted from its sewn mouth. The red glow around it flared violently, and the church began to shake. The figures in the pews recoiled, their whispers turning into cries of terror. The mirrored walls seemed to ripple and distort. The very foundations of the church groaned under some immense, unseen pressure. The preacher staggered backward, clutching at its chest, the high-pitched shriek continuing, growing louder and more piercing. Cracks began to appear in its pale, stretched skin, and a black, viscous liquid oozed from the seams. The air grew thick with a suffocating stench, a combination of decay and something acrid and sulfurous. The red glow began to fade, replaced by a flickering, sickly green light that emanated from the cracks in the preacher's form. The chanting from the pews devolved into panicked wails and moans. The silent congregation was breaking. The ritual was being disrupted. The preacher collapsed onto the altar, its body convulsing violently. The shrieking reached a deafening crescendo, and the green light pulsed erratically. Then, with a final, shuddering gasp, it went still. The green light faded, and the church was plunged into near darkness, the only illumination coming from my flashlight. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by my own ragged breathing. The figures in the pews remained still, but their posture had changed. They no longer seemed menacing, but inert, lifeless. The mirrored walls began to fade, the reflections dissolving into the darkness. Slowly, the familiar interior of the decaying church began to reappear. The shattered stained glass windows, the dusty pews, the crumbling altar. It was still terrifying, but the oppressive, malevolent energy seemed to have dissipated. I approached the altar cautiously, my flashlight beam fixed on the still form of the preacher. Its body was dissolving, the pale skin and tattered robes turning to dust, leaving behind only a residue of black, viscous liquid. The open hymn book lay on the floor, its pages now blank. The strange script had vanished. A sense of exhaustion washed over me, so profound it threatened to buckle my knees. I had faced the darkness, and somehow I had survived. I turned and walked back down the aisle, the silence of the church no longer feeling threatening, but simply empty. The heavy wooden doors stood open, leading out into the night. The fog outside had lifted, and the moon hung high in the clear sky, casting long, pale shadows. The air was cold and crisp, the silence of the woods no longer feeling oppressive, but peaceful. I stepped out of the church, not running this time, but walking, my legs heavy but my spirit lighter than it had been in days. I didn't understand what had happened, what that entity was, or why it had targeted me. But I knew, with a certainty that resonated deep within my bones, that the connection had been broken. The future I had glimpsed on the footage, it no longer felt inevitable. I drove back to my life, the rising sun painting the eastern sky with hues of orange and gold. The world felt different, sharper, more real. The lingering fear was still there, a shadow at the edge of my awareness, but it no longer held the same suffocating power. Back in my apartment, I cautiously opened my laptop. The future footage was gone. The files were still there, the recordings of my first visit to the church, but the terrifying glimpse into next week had vanished, replaced by a blank folder. A new message had appeared on the Nocturne Nexus forum from Saint Never. This time, it wasn't a direct message. It was a public post, a single chilling sentence that sent a final shiver down my spine. The choir will always seek new voices. The digital clock on my screen flickered to 3:33 a.m. A faint, distorted choir hum seemed to emanate from the speakers, so quiet I almost dismissed it as my imagination. I checked my wrists. The birthmark was still there, a small, innocuous mark on my skin, but somehow it felt different now, no longer a brand but a reminder. A reminder of the darkness I had faced, and the chilling truth that it might still be out there, lurking in the shadows, listening for the next invitation. I closed the laptop, the silence of my apartment amplifying the lingering unease. The church was gone for now, the sermon had ended, but the silence felt far from over. The digital world, the whispers in the dark, the hours between worlds, they held a different kind of terror now. A terror that knew my name, a terror that would be listening, waiting, for the next time the clock struck 3:33 a.m., and somewhere in the silent woods the choir practiced their hymns.